Hello, my name's Ian Stewart, and I'm delighted you've chosen to join me for this fourth part of the four-part series on Introduction to Problems of Evolution. So in the first talk we looked at what evolution is and some of the problems which evolution had in accounting for the origin of biological organisms. We looked at it in relation to problems of attaining the correct molecules, problems of attaining the cellular machinery, and also problems of attaining, say, the genetic code. Second talk we looked at the role of mutation in some detail as the ultimate source of all genetic variation, and in the third talk we looked at the main arguments used in favour of Darwinism. So now we're going to conclude by just making some predictions. We're going to change gear a little bit and we'll look at some of the predictions which Darwinism would make, things which, if Darwinism was true, we would expect to see. So let's just have a look at the first prediction. Well, if it is ultimately believed, this relates to chemical and molecular evolution. Not all Darwinists believe in, as it were, chemical and molecular evolution, but seeing as we're starting with these predictions, it makes sense to begin with the origin of life. If it is ultimately believed that matter plus energy over time can produce a biological organism with intelligent agency, you would predict that when we looked at a biological organism at its sort of simplest, it would be very, very simple. There would be no fundamental problem with the non-biological world, as it were, bridging that barrier. So guys like Haeckel used to say, look, all biological biological cell is, at its simplest, is just a globule plasm. So it's sort of like sea comes in, sweeps up mud. Biological life at its simplest is basically like that. There's nothing fundamentally distinguishes the biological world from the non-biological world. Now we know as knowledge increases, equipment enables us to look at the internal structure of, say, a single-celled organism. We find it's exceedingly complex. We find that same information storage retrieval system as, say, humans. Ribosomes, protein building factories, look at the propeller, rotor, stator, clutch. Exceedingly complex. So there is that fundamental distinction, and we're looking at the simplest independent single-celled organism you can think of. Being a single-celled bacterium, we're finding this huge discontinuity between the biological and the non-biological world. I should also mention that the reason why we know that biological life, say, existed 3.5 billion years ago is because we can observe stromatolites in the rock. So we know that the stromatolites that we observe in rock 3.5 billion years old, we know that it is made by action of bacteria. And that's because we can observe stromatolites today, and we find that they're structurally identical. So if biological organisms are producing identical structures, then we know the bacteria that we observed in the past were of comparable complexity to the bacteria we observe today. So you can't just say, oh, they're modern bacteria that are complex. In the past, bacteria were very simple, because they're producing identical structures. Okay, the second prediction you make is that if you do believe that you have a single biological organism, as Darwin said, he called the unit of inheritance gemmules. He knew there was variation which would have to take place in order to produce all the different, as it were, species and different classes and so on. He knew that variation would have to be brought to bear, but he didn't know what that mechanism of variation was. But you would predict, if you were a Darwinist at that time, that once that source of genetic variation, what caused genetic variation, was identified, that source of variation would display tremendous positive and innovative effects. So if you have a single-celled biological organism subject to this mechanism of variation, it would start to display positive and innovative effects to build new structures and so on under the right conditions. But when we do observe the mechanism of variation, mutation, we find that it's actually in the vast majority of occasions either bad or neutral. So that's the second Darwinistic prediction, that we expect to find this novel and innovative effect when we do all these experiments on mutations. We find, it's actually negative. Third prediction is you predict, well, if all the different classes came from a biological organism or were all connected, absolute common descent, you'd expect to see an absence of chemical blocks in biological life. You would expect to see that there is no fundamental problem with, say, Anomalocaris, just take an example, not saying it did. Say if it developed limbs, there'd be no fundamental problems with that. But actually we know that, as we looked at in the second talk in some detail, even to get, say, one of the proteins required for the Cambrian stout body structures, 400 amino acids in length, because the sequences of amino acids are so rare which give rise to an active protein, there's fundamental problems with obtaining that even granted the entire duration of the Earth. So if you're talking about a new limb, or just developing very slowly a new limb, well, you're not going to need just one new protein. You're going to need many new proteins to build a whole new cell type, a whole new cell type with whole new systems of proteins to service that cell type, and many different cell types at the same time to get the new tissue, let alone building new organs. So if you can't really get one protein, one of the important proteins, then it's not really plausible. So there's all sorts of chemical blocks. So just to review that, okay, in relation, there is that fundamental distinction between origin of life and non-life, which wasn't apparent at the day of Darwin. The source of variation now has been identified, and we know that it's essentially a bad thing. The vast majority of occasions. We also find that there are a number of chemical blocks which you wouldn't expect to find, which you do find, okay, in studies of biological organisms, how you convert one sequence to another, as it were. Problems with loss of function and so on. Fossil records simple to complex. That is actually somewhat true. If you do look at Anomalocaris, though, you look at, say, its jaw, it is much simpler than human beings. We should say the fact that something is simpler does not denote that it is ancestral to. If you gave the required elements to a scientist and say, please build me a jellyfish from the elements, okay, there's no way he's going to be able to do that. It's actually exceedingly complex. The sort of off-the-scale complexity. Is a T-Rex simpler than a pig? In many ways it is, okay, but it's not obviously ancestral. So that is broadly true, but nevertheless, with a couple of disclaimers there. It is broadly true, but the fact that something simple doesn't mean it's necessarily ancestral, particularly if there's all these chemical blocks in place. We should also mention, even say if a creationist came along, if you look at a general pattern in, say, something like Genesis 1, God takes something that's simple, like light shines through the darkness in one location, and then subsequently, day 4 or whatever, he amplifies that initial, as it were, creation. Day 2, preparation of the seeds, filling of the seed, amplification, what was already done on day 5. You see that mirror image, which people have recognized for centuries. Same in relation to land, preparation of land, filling of the land. So the fact that you begin with something simple and then develop that, as it were, outwardly, is not something which necessarily would rule out an intelligent agent. Smooth transitions between fossil record is the fifth prediction. Well, you've got, 95% species discontinuity between the Paleozoic era and the Mesozoic era. 75% of all terrestrial vertebrates, species discontinuity. Look at what used to be called the KT boundary when I was studying, Cretaceous Tertiary boundary. 70-75% species discontinuity. The golden age of the reptiles in the Cretaceous. You look at the, looks like Jurassic Park, as it were. And then you look at the tertiary immediately following it, and what do you have? It's absolutely full of mammals, tigers, all this sort of thing, mammoths, all this sort of thing. So, there is unavoidable. The reason why you have periods, the reason why you have eras, is because there are these discontinuities. So, some continuity, for example, but those examples of continuity tend to be famous for that exact reason. Okay, why do they keep bringing up, say, the loss of the horse toes? Okay. Largely because it's a very good example of evolution in action. Why don't they tend to refer to many different types of examples? Well, there aren't actually that many this is the case type examples. Say if you look at trilobites, which is one of the main arguments used in favour of evolution, it's used as a main zone fossil. Well, the three-lobed division of the exoskeleton in trilobites remains the same all the way throughout its periods of existence. So we see it in the Cambrian, and the most recent period, Permian, just before the end of the Paleozoic era. Okay, we still see trilobites still have the same basic division. Okay, nevertheless, so there is that discontinuity, and although people contest that, you can't contest it. Okay, it's unavoidable. Look at it, book in favour of evolution. Look at it through the geological periods, and the visual contrasts are unavoidable, I'm sorry to say. Let alone the Cambrian explosion, but I won't get into that. Say if Darwinists believe that you've got reptiles, they produce the birds. So they actually divided the dinosaurs, Seeley divided the dinosaurs into two categories based on the type of pelvis, because they saw that some of the dinosaurs had bird-type pelvises, some of them had reptile-type pelvises. So what would be the prediction if you believe that birds came from the reptiles? You'd predict that when you find, as it were, the first bird, what type of pelvis is it going to have? Okay, you predict that it would have a bird-type pelvis, because you think that it's branching off, as it were. You know, when you find, say, Archaeopteryx, when you find similar, as it were, first birds occurring around the same type of period, you know, they've all got Saurischian pelvises, they've all got reptile pelvises. Now, books even in favour of Darwinism, they say, okay, the development of feathers is not necessarily connected to the development of flight. I do believe, though, that maybe Archaeopteryx, say, descended from a bird which could fly, okay, but a flying reptile. I mean, so, you know, there is that, you know, prediction which doesn't work, okay, in relation to reptiles to birds. What about reptiles to mammals? Well, if we look at, say, 7 billion humans, if we look at the hundreds of thousands of different mammals that we observe in the world, there's certain things that we predict to see. We look at the genomes of all these mammals, say, a human being. If you take it'd be size 1 type, magnifying glass to read it, that size of type, 500 volumes, each volume 500 pages. Talking about a vast genome, okay, 7 billion humans, so many mammals. We look at evidence to say reptile genes. Say, for example, do we find vestigial genes for scales on the genomes of mammals? Okay, we look for them, we don't find them. So we look at the human genome, do we find, say, vestigial genes for scales? No, we don't. The best you can find is the yolk protein, which is actually a yolk precursor protein, and actually has functions such as a transporter molecule which isn't generally communicated. So the fact that someone's bringing up their yolk protein and they're bringing it up again and again, or a vitamin C gene, the fact they're bringing up these examples again and again, same examples, is the reason why they're doing that is because there aren't many good examples. You'd expect to find a huge number of examples. Simply, if all mammals came from reptiles, you'd expect, well, it's inevitable that you're going to have some vestigial scale genes, and if you don't find that, you've got to ask why. Look at the branch between reptiles and mammals. You say the neocortex associated with higher functions, entirely specific to mammals. When you look at a reptile and you look for evidence, you'd be looking for evidence, if you're a Darwinist, of a structure which became the neocortex, but you look for remnants of it and say the branch off in reptiles, but when you look for it, okay, you don't find it. You look at the atavisms which are used in relation to human beings. Why is it that a human tail, as it were, you know, you see in the development of the embryo in the womb, the human being have a tail, the coccyx is the curvature at the bottom. If you had that, if we had a spine which is just flat at the bottom, you'd have extreme difficulty sitting. This is why it's recommended that it isn't removed in any well, it isn't removed even if you're in extreme pain. Look at, say, the tail there. It's obviously not a tail of a pre-existing ancestor. You're really arguing that used to be an ape that used to walk around with a tail like that, and that's one of the best examples. Okay, if you had a big furry tail or something, then you know, this clearly does not belong to a human being. That's the sort of thing you predict in Darwinism, but you don't actually find it. Okay, it always looks like an abnormality. Look at, say, the extra nipples along the milk line. Why is it they're always human nipples? Why isn't it, say, a silverback nipple, which would be a major giveaway if you were to find that? Okay, but they're always human nipples. Why do we look at the human genome and find there's no genes for scales, vestigial genes for scales? Why do we not find Paleozoic genes if all organisms ultimately derive from Paleozoic animals? Okay, and so we've been looking for these things and we don't find them. If we look at, say, junk DNA argument, that was another. We predict that if human beings ultimately came through this random process, that we'd ultimately expect to find that there'd be all these genes which didn't possess a function. They said, well, look at the size of the human genome, massive, 500 volumes, 500 pages, size 1 type, 98% has no function. That's what you predict if you're a Darwinist. You're in real trouble if you're a creationist, but we actually now find that over 80% does have function. Okay, so there was, you know, a number of creationists at the time, but that, I mean, old Earth creationists at the time were just saying, look, you know, we predict that they will find function for these large numbers of the rest of the human genome, that as knowledge increases, we will find function for that. And there was that nice contrast between the two, as it were, predictions, and we found that the evidence has come in on the creationist side. So just a quick review there. What are the things that we would conclude? Well, it is the case that, say, a creationist would look at it and he would say, well, if we look at biological life, there is that fundamental distinction between life and non-life, therefore we'd expect to observe characteristics, okay, which distinguish biological life from non-life. We find, for example, a code present in the biological world, we do not find it in the non-biological world, okay. We'd in fact, if you have a genome that is relatively streamlined, you introduce randomness into it, it's going to have a negative effect, a creationist would say. If you look at, it's not going to be a simple thing to convert, say, a worm into a human being. There's going to be all sorts of chemical blocks. You would expect that to occur. Simple to complex. Well, we look at, say, a pattern in Genesis 1. You'd expect that something begins. God amplifies what He's already done. To put the Bible basher hat on the Adam Eve. You take something that's already in existence and develop something from it. So you do have that simple to complex type pattern, which just seems to be consistent with, say, a Genesis 1 type pattern. That is only in relation to a simple to complex, but I accept there's other things to consider there. Well, we expect fundamental, at least some example, well, you expect a pattern of discontinuity in the fossil record, which is what you observe if you're a creationist. You'd expect to see that there'd be problems with saying that a bird just simply derived from reptiles, that if you expect to see there'd be problems with saying that reptiles developed into mammals, and when we look at the genomes we don't find the scale genes, we don't find a remnant of a neocortex, we don't find any of these things, and that's what you'd expect if you were a creationist. If man is a special creation, you wouldn't expect any developmental problems to just be expressing human characteristics, okay? And likely in relation to the junk DNA, you'd expect DNA to have a function. So in conclusion, we just make a comparison there. We have ancient creationism, 8.5, and the theory of evolution, a half. So thank you for tuning in, and I hope some of the points we've raised have made you think a bit. And I think if you do observe those different comparisons, then it becomes clear that the belief that, say, an intelligent agent created biological life is impossible to ignore. I think if you look at the predictions which one would make, life once it's made, I think you could see that there's pretty strong evidence that a intelligent agent has been involved, and it cannot purely be explained, the variety that we observe today, through biological processes. Okay, that's me, so thanks for joining me.